For nearly 30 years, the Spice Girls have been remembered as the group that made girl power a household phrase, sold records by the tens of millions, and turned 5 very different young women into the most recognizable pop act on the planet. The official story of their unraveling has always centered on one date, May 31, 1998, the day Geri Halliwell walked away from the band in the middle of a world tour. But in the summer of 2026, Melanie Chisholm, known to the world as Mel C or Sporty Spice, sat down for a conversation on the Louis Theroux podcast that pulled the timeline back 2 years earlier, to a single drunken sentence outside the Brit Awards in February 1996. What she described was not a scandal in the tabloid sense. It was something quieter and in its own way more revealing. A 21-year-old being told in no uncertain terms that one more mistake could cost her everything she had ever wanted. A night that started like a fairy tale. By early 1996, the Spice Girls were not yet famous. Wannabe would not be released until that July, and the 5 of them were still, in Mel C's own description, relative unknowns navigating the outer edges of the British music industry. Still, they had already signed with Virgin Records, and their management, led by Simon Fuller, had secured them a table at the Brit Awards. A genuine coup for a group that hadn't put out a single record yet. Mel C has recalled the night as intoxicating in every sense. Champagne flowing, the 5 of them seated near Lenny Kravitz, and a rare sense that the fantasy they had been chasing since their teens might actually be within reach. According to Mel C's account on the podcast, tension had already started brewing earlier that evening over something that, on the surface, sounds almost absurdly small. She had taken her hair out of its usual ponytail, and some of her bandmates felt she was straying from the group's carefully coordinated look before they had even released a single song. It was a preview of just how tightly managed the group's image was, even in its infancy, and how quickly disagreements over presentation could ripple through 5 strong personalities. Then, as the night wound down and the group headed out to find their car, the real flashpoint arrived. Mel C has described turning to Victoria Adams, the future Victoria Beckham, and telling her to F*** off. A comment she has since characterized as an offhand, drunken remark rather than anything calculated or cruel. She went home, went to bed, and woke up the next morning to find herself in serious trouble. 2 of her bandmates, Mel B and Geri Halliwell, confronted her about the comment, and Simon Fuller made the stakes explicit. If anything like that happened again, she would be out of the group. For a young woman who had spent years dreaming of exactly this kind of opportunity, the warning landed like a verdict. Mel C has said the moment left her terrified that she had ruined everything before it had even properly begun. In later interviews, including her appearance on Desert Island Discs, she has described how that single warning reshaped her behavior for years afterward. She began, in her words, policing herself constantly, terrified that one wrong word or one poorly judged moment in public could unravel a career she had wanted since childhood. It is a strikingly candid admission from someone whose stage persona, the athletic, confident Sporty Spice, was built almost entirely on the appearance of fearlessness. 5 strangers assembled to look like best friends. To understand why that single incident carried so much weight, it helps to go back to how the Spice Girls came together in the first place, because they were never meant to be friends who happened to form a band. They were, from the very start, a calculated experiment in contrast. In late 1993, the father and son management team of Bob and Chris Herbert, operating through their company Heart Management, set out to build a British girl group capable of rivaling the boy bands then dominating the pop charts. Rather than searching for 5 performers who sounded and looked alike, the Herberts deliberately sought out difference. An advertisement placed in the Stage, the British trade magazine for performers, called for young women who could sing, dance, and hold a room with confidence. Reportedly more than 400 hopefuls showed up to audition, and over months of callbacks and rehearsals, the field narrowed to 5. Melanie Brown, Melanie Chisholm, Victoria Adams, Geri Halliwell, and a 5th singer named Michelle Steptoe, sometimes referred to in early press as Michelle Stevenson, who had a strong voice and had secured a place in the original lineup. That version of the group never made it to a record deal. As rehearsals continued through 1994, Steptoe found it increasingly difficult to balance the demands of the project with family responsibilities, including caring for a parent who was seriously ill, and Heart Management reportedly had concerns about whether her commitment matched the intensity the other 4 were bringing to the project. She departed in early 1994 and was replaced by an 18-year-old dancer and singer named Emma Bunton. It turned out to be the missing piece. Bunton's warmth and youthful energy completed a chemistry that, within a couple of years, would become instantly recognizable to millions of people who had never even met the 5 of them. Each member soon settled into an identity. Chisholm became the athletic, no-nonsense sporty Spice. Brown became the outspoken high-energy scary Spice. Bunton became the sweet, playful baby Spice. Adams, soon to be Beckham, became the elegant, understated posh Spice. Anne Halliwell became the flamboyant, headline-grabbing Ginger Spice, whose Union Jack dress would later become one of the most reproduced images in pop culture. Notably, those nicknames weren't invented by the group themselves. They were popularized by the British magazine Top of the Pops in 1996, after journalists began looking for a shorthand to describe 5 very distinct personalities to readers. That distinctiveness was the entire selling point. Instead of one idealized version of femininity, the Spice Girls offered 5, and fans gravitated toward whichever one felt most like them. It made the group feel less like a band and more like 5 separate brands sharing one name, and it worked spectacularly. Wannabe, released on July 8, 1996, became a global phenomenon almost overnight, eventually topping the charts in more than 30 countries and becoming the first single by a British girl group to reach number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 in the United States. Their debut album, Spice, released that November, went on to sell more than 23 million copies worldwide, making it one of the best-selling albums by a female group in music history. The cost behind the curtain. What that kind of overnight fame doesn't show in the highlight reels is the toll it takes on 5 people barely out of their teens who were, by their own later admissions, still figuring out who they were as individuals. The touring schedule was relentless. Television appearances in London one day, long-haul flights to New York or Tokyo the next. Privacy essentially disappeared. Every hairstyle, every rumored friendship, every photograph of a facial expression became fodder for a British tabloid press that, by the late 1990s, had built entire sections of newspapers around celebrity gossip. Within that pressure cooker, the same warning Mel C had received after the 1996 Brit Awards never really went away. She has spoken openly in the years since about living with a kind of low-grade fear throughout the group's peak. A constant self-monitoring, worrying about saying the wrong thing or behaving in a way that might jeopardize her place in something she had wanted her entire life. She has also been candid, in interviews and in her memoir, about struggling with depression and disordered eating during and after her time in the group, describing the pressure to project constant positivity and energy as genuinely exhausting to sustain. Geri Halliwell carried her own private weight into the group's early years. Before the Spice Girls formed, she lost her father, Lawrence, who died of a heart attack in 1993, a loss she has since described as leaving her almost paralyzed by grief at the time, without, in her words, the tools to properly process it. She has spoken about how that grief fed directly into her drive to succeed, describing her ambition in the years that followed as something close to gas in the tank. At the same time, she has been open about struggling with bulimia during the height of the group's fame, describing it as an attempt to claw back a sense of control over a life that had started to feel dictated entirely by other people's schedules and expectations. Mental health professionals have long noted that eating disorders often intensify during periods when someone feels they've lost agency over other parts of their life, and Halliwell's account fits that pattern closely. There were other undercurrents too. In 2019, Mel B told Piers Morgan in a televised interview that she and Geri Halliwell had slept together once during the group's early years, describing it as something that happened between 2 young, close friends enjoying life, while adding that she suspected Halliwell would be upset with her for saying so publicly. Halliwell has never publicly confirmed or elaborated on that account. The revelation inevitably reignited tabloid speculation about whether it had played some role in the group's internal tensions, but no member of the band, including Mel B herself, has ever suggested it was connected to Halliwell's eventual departure. Most people who have studied the group's history treat it as one more data point in a genuinely complicated situation rather than any kind of central explanation. The day Ginger Spice walked out. By the spring of 1998, none of this strain was visible from the outside. The Spice Girls were still one of the biggest acts on the planet. Their second album, Spice World, had sold millions of copies, the accompanying feature film had been a box office success, and the Spice World Tour had launched that February to sold-out arenas across Europe before heading to North America. Then, on May 31, 1998, Geri Halliwell announced she was leaving the group, in the middle of that same world tour. The departure itself unfolded in confusion. Mel B has since recalled the surreal atmosphere at the hotel where the group was staying, with members of the touring team searching the building trying to track Halliwell down, initially assuming she had simply stepped away for some air. It gradually became clear this was something far more permanent. In a statement issued through her lawyers, Halliwell said she was leaving because of differences between herself and the rest of the group, while acknowledging the enormous pressure that had come with their success and expressing hope that fans would keep supporting the remaining four. With years of hindsight, it's become clear that no single incident fully explains that decision. What emerges instead, across dozens of interviews with all five members over the decades, is a picture of five ambitious young women navigating a level of global fame that none of them had been prepared for, while trying to agree on decisions, creative, financial, and personal, that increasingly carried enormous consequences. As the group's commercial stakes grew, so did the friction involved in keeping five distinct, headstrong personalities pointed in the same direction. Rather than cancel the tour, Mel B, Mel C, Emma Bunton, and Victoria Beckham pressed on as a four-piece. The group went on to record a third and final studio album, Forever, released in November 2000. It debuted at number 2 on the UK Albums Chart and produced 2 UK number 1 singles, Holler and Let Love Lead the Way, but it sold significantly fewer copies than its predecessors and marked a noticeable shift toward a more contemporary R&B sound. A reminder, as several of the members later acknowledged, that the group's original chemistry had depended on the specific interplay between all five original personalities, not simply on the brand name. Fear, fame, and what came after. Mel C's 2026 comments don't rewrite the Spice Girls' history so much as they add texture to it. The group's story has always been told as one of unstoppable momentum. Five ordinary women thrust into extraordinary fame almost overnight, but what her account makes clear is how much quiet anxiety sat underneath that momentum for at least one member, arguably more for years afterward. She has described herself as naturally more introverted than her stage persona suggested, someone who had to learn to project energy and confidence that didn't always come naturally, while carrying the memory of a single sentence at the Brit Awards that nearly ended her career before it started. That fear didn't end when the group hit number 1. If anything, according to Mel C's own retelling, it intensified as the stakes grew higher. Every album, every tour, every interview now carrying commercial weight that a warning from Simon Fuller in 1996 had already taught her not to take for granted. It's a useful corrective to the idea that fame simply solves anxiety. For at least one member of one of the best-selling girl groups of all time, it seems to have sharpened it instead. The five of them have, notably, endured. Despite Hallowell's departure in 1998 and years of occasional public tension, including Mel B's 2019 revelation, the group reunited for a world tour in 2007 and 2008, and again for the Spice World Stadium Tour in 2019, both of which drew massive crowds and suggested that whatever strain existed behind the scenes hadn't erased the genuine affection between the five of them. As of 2026, with Wannabe marking its 30th anniversary, all five members have confirmed there is no reunion tour planned to mark the occasion, though they've said they remain in regular contact, and Hallowell in particular has spoken publicly about hoping the group eventually comes back together as one. Perhaps that's the most honest way to understand what nearly derailed the Spice Girls, and what ultimately did split the original lineup in 1998. Not one scandal, not one villain, but years of accumulated pressure sitting just beneath one of the most cheerful public images in pop music history. The group built an empire on the idea that young women could be confident, unapologetic, and unshakable together. Mel C's account decades later is a reminder that living up to that message in private was a far harder job than it ever looked on stage.